Good evening, everyone. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of Columbia, DC, and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to start by welcoming our partners, Harvard and MIT clubs of Washington, DC, and their members for joining us this evening. We are honored to have Professor Kian Tajbakhsh from Columbia University Office of the President and Professor Djavad Salehi Isfahani from Virginia Tech to discuss Iran at the dawn of its new century. We are also privileged to have a veteran journalist and author, Nazila Fathi, as our host. So please allow me to briefly introduce our incredible panel, but I do encourage all to check our website for their full bios. Kian Tajbakhsh is Senior Advisor to the Executive Vice President for Global Centers at Columbia University. In this role, Dr. Tajbakhsh works on university-wide initiatives focused on global migration. He's also a fellow with Columbia's Committee on Global Thought, where he teaches in the Global Thought MA program. Among his foreign policy publications is Who Wants What from Iran Now? The Post-Nuclear Deal U.S. Policy Debate in 2018. And he's currently completing a book on local government, democracy, and state building in modern Iran. Djavad Salehi Isfahani has taught at the University of Pennsylvania and Virginia Tech, where he is currently professor of economics. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development of the Brookings Institution, research affiliate at the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center, Harvard Kennedy School, and research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. His current research is on economic inequality and economics of the family in the Middle East. Last but not least, Nazila Fathi is a journalist and commentator on Iran and the author of The Lonely War, One Woman's Account of the Struggle for Modern Iran. She was awarded a Raoul Wallenberg Fellowship at Lund University in 2003, Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard in 2010-11, Shorenstein Fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School in 2012, and an association at Harvard Belfer Center in 2012-13. As a hobby, she writes children's books. My Name is Cyrus, and Avicenna, the father of modern medicine, are among them. Without further ado, Nazila, please take it away.
Thank you, Kambiz, for the introduction. It's such an honor to be here with Kian and Djavad. Before we start the questions, I'd like to start with a few words about Nowruz, the Persian New Year holiday, which has started on Saturday at 5:37 a.m. Eastern Time. We will celebrate the New Year. We will usher in the year 1400, which is what this event is named after. Nowruz, known as the Persian New Year, is one of the most ancient celebrations in history. It's been celebrated for over 4,000 years and is rooted in Zoroastrianism, which was the main religion in ancient Persia. Nowruz is a holiday for millions of people from diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds who usher in the new year on the spring equinox on March 20th or March 21st. Nowruz is still the most important celebration for Iranians, as well as for some 300 million people in the neighboring countries from different ethnic and religious backgrounds that were once part of Persia. While the physical region called Persia no longer exists, the traditions of Nowruz are strong among people in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, India, Pakistan, Turkey, and now Canada and the United States, where many Iranians live. People who celebrate Nowruz regard it as a secular holiday. Over time, Nowruz has become the embodiment and essence of the Iranian culture. It's not just celebration of the new year, it is a symbol that proclaims that people who live in these regions have not given up their ancient traditions. So an early happy Nowruz to everybody. And Kian, I would like to start the question with you, if possible, because this is going to be a new year, and Iranians have always spoken about their visions for the future. What is Iranians' vision for the future of Iran? Is it the same for everybody, or are there different visions?
Well, Nazila, first of all, let me thank Combies and the Columbia University Club of Washington for inviting me to speak on this panel. And I'm pleased to be with two old friends, Nazila and Djavad. It's a great honor to speak with them. If you've posed a very good question, and if you don't mind, I'd like to share my screen and discuss a little bit about how I'm thinking about answering this question about the different visions of Iranians for the future. So if I may share my screen, I will, okay, 1 second, share. Okay, is that sharing?
Yes.
Okay, and I will, what I thought I'd do today, because you framed the issue in terms of the Iranians entering into the new millennium, into the new century of the Iranian calendar, 1400. And I wanted to share with you some of the ways I am thinking about the vision of Iranians thinking about the future. But I get to that through two dimensions of the work that I'm doing. I'm working on a project, which hopefully will be a book project, called "What Are Iranians Dreaming About?" And what I want to share with you today is two dimensions of the framework that I'm using. The first is about the present, and the second is about the future. And I'm going to now share with you what I think is some of the main controversies and challenges facing Iranians inside and outside Iran, but also those thinking about Iran, about how to characterize our present before I move on to the visions. Now here, very quickly, I want to discuss three dimensions of what I think are major controversies and debates about contemporary Iran. The first on the left you'll see is about ideology, is about the nature of the political system, and the third is foreign policy. And I'm going to contrast two different points of view on how to answer these questions. And I'm just going to go through these very briefly, and we can enter into nuance during the question and answer. So in terms of the first, the question of Islamist ideology of the nizam or the regime inside Iran. The question here is it a foundation or is it a mask? And what the point of view that I refer to as the accommodationists view versus the adversarial view. The accommodationists will say that the Islamist ideology is merely rhetoric or window dressing. Chants such as death to America, death to Israel should not really be taken very seriously. And the assumption seems to be that the Islamic Republic is best seen as an aggrieved post-colonial independence movement resisting the depredations of foreign influence. Now, by contrast, the adversarial view, it does take the Islamist ideology of the regime seriously. It says its anti-liberal, anti-Western posture is an authentic expression of the regime's position, and it's a key driver of domestic and foreign policy. So a consistent strategy over 4 decades is compatible with flexible tactics. And in the question and answer, I could address what I think are a confusion around the question of whether the Islamic Republic is pragmatic or not. Now, quickly turning to the second issue of the nature of the regime, there's also contrasting views. The accommodationist view tends to see it, the distribution of political power in the regime as flat, like a playing field, whereas the adversarial view tends to see it as a pyramid. So one view sees it as the regime as still undergoing a struggle for the soul of the goals of the 1979 revolution. They see that the nature of the regime is in play. It's still a reformist versus hardliners duking it out to shape the system. The picture here is of multiple voices, power centers competing to shape policy, and the supreme leader is viewed as a mediator or balancer. Now, by contrast, the other view rejects this idea and sees the political system in Iran as a pyramid, not as a flat playing field. They see it as a consolidated authoritarian regime. Some dissidents and democratic reformers inside Iran refer to it as a form of religious despotism. And so they don't see it as a hybrid political system, a hybrid of theocracy and democracy. And they don't view elections in Iran as a bottom-up expression of popular will that injects interest into the political system. Rather, they see elections as an instrument of top-down rule, authoritarian rule. We can now move to the third dimension, and that is foreign policy. And here the question is Iran a country or a cause? The accommodationist view insists that Iran is a quote-unquote normal country. You hear this many times, and you see many articles insisting on this. In this view, the regional policies undertaken by the Islamic Republic, the enmity with Israel and the United States, reflect long-standing security concerns, predating the Islamic Republic, and Iran, because it suffers from what they refer to as strategic loneliness. And this makes Iran reach for strategic depth, and its policies are seen as pragmatic. Now, in terms of the relationship with the United States, the question here is whether where we trace the source of the broken relationship with the United States. The accommodationist view tends to see the broken relationship as a result of a kind of misunderstanding and leading to a series of missed opportunities and bad luck and bad timing. The motivation or the assumption underlying this seems to be that the Islamic Republic's leadership really seeks reconciliation with the US, but the bloc is a kind of irrational American prejudice. Now, contrasting this is the view that no, in fact, the Islamic Republic is a cause. It is what it says it is and what it has declared itself to be for the last 4 decades. In this view, the Islamic Republic is a revisionist state. It rejects the US-led post-1945 international system. Of course, in practice, it exploits the system to undermine it. It has one foot in, one foot out. And sometimes this is described as Iran playing a double game, or sometimes described as being stuck between these two positions and not quite sure where it wants to end up. The goal of Iran is to upend the Middle East regional state system, expel the US, and achieve regional dominance or primacy. Now, in terms of the nuclear crisis, there is also a contrasting view, and this helps us, I think, understand it. The accommodationist view sees the blockage of the nuclear negotiations in the technical details, but the other view doesn't see that. It says the devil is actually not in the details. The dispute with the West is really not about technical details or negotiating formulas, but it's about a fundamental disagreement over the nature of world order. Now, this is the present, the way I'm framing it. And of course, if we approach this as two hypotheses, we could ask, where does the evidence lie? And I don't have time to go into this, but I would say, based on 20 years of living and working in Iran and researching on Iran for 2 decades, I would say the preponderance of the evidence supports the adversarial position. But of course, there are positions in the middle or in between, and we can discuss the nuances later. Now, based on this present, we can now look and think about the visions you asked about, Nazila. And the question here is, not just visions in the abstract, but as I understand it in my research, what I see are the real live options for Iranians living inside Iran and outside Iran. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but because I've written this in my essay, What Are Iranians Dreaming About? But I'll just summarize here before I end. There are three basic visions of the future. One is the Velayat Islamists. I refer to them as the Velayat Madar, is the current rulers in Iran. And they have a pure vision of an Islamic state and society, which they view as a long-term project, measured probably in centuries. And it's implacably anti-West and tries to create an alternative model of society and international relations. This group, I should point out, has two subgroups, the core elite leadership, but also the economic pragmatists around the Rafsanjani type program. And it's important to notice that currently the Velayat Islamists, as I refer to them, currently face no internal or external opposition inside Iran. The second group are the Islamic Reformists, or what I call Muslim Democrats. Their vision is what I call a plural but non-liberal Muslim democracy. It's sort of modeled on the Tunisia and Ennahda party in post-2016, where Ennahda abandoned political Islam in its traditional form. The Islamic Reformists, as I've defined it here, have been politically banished after 2009. Based on this definition, then the current administration of President Rouhani does not fall into what I would refer to as the reformists. Finally, the secular Republicans, the third vision of the future that Iranians, I think, can slot into, are secular republicanism with or without monarchy. The vision here is of a secular state, a modern secular society aligned with the Western world. Sociologically, most of those that adhere to this live outside of Iran, either in exile or in diaspora. And those who adhere to this vision inside Iran have no legal existence. They live a kind of shadow existence and live a kind of don't ask, don't tell limbo. And these are the three main visions that I see going forward. I ignore armed opposition and Marxist groups in this categorization. And so I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I would just say in conclusion that the way I frame our analysis of the present and the future, I think may help Iranians have a wider conversation, wider ranging conversation about these visions of the future. And any accommodation, any resolution of the tensions will probably have to accommodate all three. And so, sorry, I've gone a little bit over, Nazila, but I'll stop here.
Thank you for the slides. They were very helpful. And I'd like to come back to you with more questions, but I want to go to Djavad now and ask Djavad about the economy. 2020 was a difficult year for almost every country because of COVID and the pandemic. But it was particularly hard for Iranians because of the former President Trump's sanctions on Iran and maximum pressure. Can you please tell us what happened to Iran's economy since those sanctions were introduced? How has it impacted the people and the government?
Thank you, Nazila. It's very nice to be here with you, with Kian, and I want to thank Kambiz for inviting me. I thought you were going to ask a bigger question because we are turning century. This happens to be a very bad year. If you go 100 years back, unfortunately, you also start at a very, very bad time. That's after the Second World War. The country was occupied by various forces, the Ottomans, the Russians, the British. There were famines and all sorts of bad things. But if you go from that perspective of people who experienced those things, and some of them are still alive, to today, you might actually get a more reasonable view of how Iranians view the present and the future. If you permit me, I can show you a couple of slides. I have more slides, but okay, good. Do you see the graph now?
Yes.
Very good. So what I'm showing here is the long run of Iran's economic growth. And you're asking about what happens at this very end after in 2018, 2019. I can talk about that, but permit me to go a little bit backward. So if you go all the way back to 1950, this is particularly useful data comes from the Madison Project. And the reason why I like this particular graph is because it compares Iran with Turkey. I'm thinking of Turkey as a kind of a country Iran might have been. One of the things you see here is that Iran and Turkey are similar in some sense, especially in the 10 years before the sanctions around here. But Iran was much more turbulent than Turkey. Turkey has been a kind of a model country, trucking along, experiencing economic growth, changing people's lives, and so on. Iran was hit by an oil boom. It has a very good experience of economic growth in the 1960s, lots of transformation, land reform in particular. And then something goes wrong. Nobody quite knows what, but we can talk about that. So there's a revolution, then there's a war, and there's a lot of destruction. So living standards, which I'm measuring here by GDP per capita, it's the simplest measure of living standards, really collapses. But then after that, things begin to pick up. And you have another 20-year period of economic growth, very much like the 20 years before the revolution. And this one is interrupted in a more purposeful way, understandable way, because of the standoff between the United States and Iran. If you're interested in the impact of sanctions, there's another series on living standards that is very similar to the Madison Project. These are called Penn World Tables. Most economists use these data to study economic growth, various aspects of it. For some reason, these calculations, something they've done differently from the Madison Project, that shows Iran departing from the trend it had itself and the trend that Turkey continues. Turkey is the red line. Sanctions come in 2010 or 2011. That's when Obama ratcheted up the sanctions, especially the extraterritorial sanctions. And Iran's economy begins to decline. This is living standards falling. What Trump did was just to build on that, to continue on that. According to these data, again, the other series would show a little different than these, but this is the most dramatic picture I can paint to you. And if you do the calculations, Iran has lost at least maybe 1 year of GDP to these sanctions. I can show you a little bit more if you bear with me on, I have a graph here on living standards. These come from much more precise data. These are per capita expenditures of Iranians who live in Tehran, it's the green line, urban areas other than Tehran, the red line, and the dark blue line, which is the rural areas. And here you see even a more dramatic picture of economic decline, but also of differences in the impact of sanctions. If you think of sanctions hitting about here, the Tehranis don't seem to have done too badly. I think the reason is that Tehran takes the first cut on any money that comes into the country, followed by urban areas and then followed by rural areas. Rural areas are now, in real terms, I've turned these into real per capita expenditures, so inflation is taken out. A typical rural household is taken back all the way to 1998 in its living standards. An urban family is taken back to 2002, and a Tehrani family back to maybe 2005 and 6. So you see in data that is very detailed, coming from the Statistical Center of Iran. These are surveys, lots of surveys, and they publish it, luckily, so we can get very, very focused micro data. And if you look at poverty rates, now you see the same picture, but now we're looking at the suffering of Iranians who are below a poverty line that the World Bank uses is $5.50 in purchasing power parity. And the brunt of these sanctions are being felt now by rural households who are not receiving a whole lot of government services. Excuse me. And also lately by everyone else in Iran. Maybe I should stop just here. I think I've given you enough of a depressing picture. If you go back to a longer period, larger zoom, I can try to be a bit more optimistic.
Wow. I mean, the sanctions were supposed to have an impact on the government, not on the people, but you're telling us that it has definitely impacted the living standards of Iranians, and most of all, those who live in rural areas or urban areas. Kian, have you noticed any change in the behavior of the Islamic Republic since these sanctions were intensified? Is there any evidence that these sanctions have impacted the behavior of the regime?
Okay, unmute. Okay, well, I mean, we can take them in different dimensions. I mean, the political system in Iran, Djavad's work is the singular best source for information on the state of household economy in Iran. And it shows that the government over the last couple of decades has been actually quite nimble in responding to sanction pressures as it impacts families inside Iran. That is to say, if you're referring to policies inside Iran, the government was quite good at turning towards cash transfers to help poorer families. So that was not let us say, a direct intention of the sanctions, but the government did change its policies to accommodate this new reality. In terms of the foreign policy, I don't think there is much evidence that the overall strategy of the Islamic Republic has changed in terms of its regional ambition. So if we talk about what Iranian foreign policy is in the region, and then Iranian foreign policy, let's say, in terms of the nuclear file, we can treat these separately. But I think in general, what we've seen is the government in Iran maintaining its strategic posture, as I was trying to describe in the first slide, that adversarial posture, that is to say, it has stuck to its principles and has stuck to what it wants to do. So in general, I would say in terms of support of proxies in the region, Iran has not pulled back that much. And in terms of the nuclear file, we see that the willingness to maintain an antagonistic position with the West has increased. I will make one point though, which is that one of the debates which you find amongst the Iranian community or in the Iranian policy community is what the impact of sanctions was in terms of bringing Iran to the table after 2012. And I think the evidence shows that sanctions were uniquely responsible for bringing the Iranian government to the negotiating table after 2012. Even though the so-called accommodationist position discounts this and says that sanctions did not change the behavior of the Iranian government. In fact, senior current Biden administration sanctions experts who have written the history of that do concede that, in fact, sanctions had a direct impact on bringing the Iranian government to the negotiating table. So it's not that sanctions don't have any impact, it's that they have to be designed in a way much more targeted.
Djavad, I tried to figure out exactly what those spikes in the charts were. There were at least 2 or 3 of them. And I was guessing perhaps one of them was in 2015, 2016, when the Obama administration lifted sanctions on Iran and Iran's GDP got a boost. And there was another one, I think it appeared to be like a spike in the first chart. I thought maybe it was in 2009 or 8, maybe when Iran had a huge oil revenue because oil prices went up. And now the Biden administration is trying to resume talks with Iran, and there's a lot of hopes that it would reach some kind of deal with Iran and ease the sanctions. Do you think there is a chance for economic recovery for Iran if those sanctions are eased? Would it lead to some kind of GDP growth?
Yes, absolutely. I think you pointed to one of those spikes that speaks directly to this question. In 2016, which was the first time that sanctions were actually removed. You know, the deal was signed in July 2015, but for 6 months, Iran had to show that it was sticking with the deal before sanctions were removed. So sometime in January, US certified that Iran was sticking by the deal and started easing, not removing sanctions. They simply eased some of the sanctions. Some of the Iranian money that was frozen abroad found its way to Iran. Iran's economy grew by 13% that year, which is a record for Iran. It's not too surprising because Iran's economy is very much like what you call this, like Jack in the Box, when something is held under pressure. It's not a lethargic economy. Iranians have a lot of energy. It's a very youthful society, as you know, because of the baby boom during the revolution. The largest age group are now people in their 30s. They're very well educated, and there is a fairly vibrant private sector that people ignore, and it does throw its weight around. You know, it has money, it's very well organized, it publishes the most widely circulated business press, like Dunyai Iqtisad, Tijarat News. They have a lot, there's Iqtisad Online. All these are financed by people who make money making things, the business people, and they want sanctions removed. And the reason why they want sanctions removed is because they got projects, they got things to do. As soon as they hear that they can buy the raw material from Germany instead of from China, they will rush. They get onto a plane, go to Frankfurt, talk to their old business deals, friends, and they start producing. Iran will have some oil money. if sanctions are removed. So that will kind of grease all the wheels. But I don't want to play too much of this on oil and cash coming in, because Iran's economy is a lot more complicated than oil. In about 20 years ago, about half of Iran's economy was oil in terms of value add. And now it's 15%, 1.5. And part of that is, of course, because of sanctions. But I doubt very much that it can go above 25% if sanctions are removed. So all the other part of the GDP, which employs 25, 26 million people, again, very energetic, fairly educated people who want to do things. Now, whether or not these geopolitics will stop them in their tracks, and this will not happen, this remains to be seen. I am not too pessimistic, although things right now, as you know, are not going well between Iran and the United States. But I do think that United States may decide that it wants to be on the side of the Iranian middle class and the business sector, and not stand by squeezing the breath out of them, because nothing good comes out of that. And I think that's one of the good things about Biden's administration. They're more thoughtful than the previous administration.
We want to open up the conversation to the audience. So please, if you have any questions, type it up in the chat box or in the Q&A. I'm going to ask one more question from Kian, and then wait for questions to come in. Kian, what are the key dimensions and options facing the Biden administration regarding Iran's nuclear deal, JCPOA, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I think that, the parameters of the nuclear deal are, in a sense, have been set by the prior two administrations. So part of, I think, what the Biden administration is working with is trying to calibrate and triangulate let us say, the accommodationist role of the accommodationist position of the Obama administration and the very adversarial position of the Trump administration. And it seems that the Biden administration has taken on the lessons of the last 8 years in a way that, I mean, it looks like, we'll have to see how this goes forward, but it looks like that the talk has been that they want to find a kind of JCPOA 1.5, not entirely new, but not entirely the same as going back to the 2015. So unless there is a major change in the Biden administration from what we are hearing currently, it's unlikely that they will go back to the exact same 2015 deal. And it's also unlikely that, it's very unlikely that they will push forwards the kind of maximum demands that the Trump administration was asking, set out, for example, in the Pompeo 12-point parameters that he's talked about in 2018, and that they will try to calibrate somewhere in between. And so I think that, we'll have to see. The Biden administration has said that they are not interested in, they are not including the upcoming presidential election in Iran as part of their calculations. Of course, practice and rhetoric may diverge, but if they're sticking to that, then it seems that the Biden administration has taken on board some of what they see as the success of the Trump administration's harder position, but they're going to be more nuanced about it. They're going to work with allies more closely and to repair some of the damage that was done by the unilateral retreat from the JCPOA. So in sum, I think that from what I'm seeing, they're calibrating somewhere in between these two of the last 8 years and trying to learn the lessons of them, and I hope they do.
Djavad, you had a piece today that it was very interesting, and in 2 lines you summarized the situation beautifully. I'm going to read those 2 lines. Some in the United States understand the pain of ordinary people as a ticking time bomb that the Iranian government will eventually be forced to defuse. But the office of Iran's supreme leader has its eye on the long game, in which short-term suffering may be a price worth paying for long-term self-sufficiency. How long is this game going to go on?
Hopefully not very long, because it is having really very big impact on Iranians. I've talked to Iranians, as I'm sure you do. This is a very sad and grim new year for them. They were hopeful, as I mentioned in that article that you mentioned that came out today in Foreign Affairs. They were really hoping for better outcome from the Biden administration, but it didn't work out. What is going on right now is that I think and this is probably more in the purview of the kind of work that Kian does, sort of international relations, national politics than mine. The government is trying to assert itself in the region. So the long game is to say, you cannot prevent us, you cannot subdue us with sanctions. This is, I think, a big point that Iranians are facing right now. Is there a way for a third world nation to come up and be counted like a European country, like Japan, even like Korea, and not be treated as subservient, that you have to listen to MBS in Saudi Arabia or Netanyahu in Israel, you have to work with them. I may not agree with everything they say, but I think that's an objective that's very important for Iranians. I think a lot of Iranians I talk to like to be treated as equal with Saudi Arabia, if not like a more serious nation, because it's larger and has influence over Central Asia and so on. What has to happen, I think, is for the Islamic Republic to realize that in order to assert itself in the region, in order to be able to fight sanctions, it needs a better economy still than it has. What it is seeing now, which is not a collapsing economy, and it has been actually quite remarkable that they have been able to maintain employment. Manufacturing has been doing well, not well, it's been doing okay. It has actually added workers. And the reason is quite obvious, because when the currency depreciates the way it has, local production becomes much more profitable compared to imports. And that's something that Iranians have switched to. It's not a happy thing to do. It also means that real wages in Iran declined enough that they can now beat any production in the region, in Central Asia. They can beat China in a lot of markets if they can move their money around. This is a very important realization if the government realizes that Iranian private sector can benefit hugely. And as a result, young people who are waiting for jobs, families who want to send their children to good schools, there's going to be a lot of economic growth that will come if Iran can simply move money around. If it can sell whatever it's selling, and I know many companies, they sell a lot of goods, variety of goods, small things, from furniture to electrical appliances and so on. They can sell these things, and cars, by the way, in the region and bring in money and create jobs, but they need sanctions removed. So that is, I think, where things stand right now. I think the hardliners in Iran are still hoping against hope that with sanctions, that the economy can actually grow 3, 4, 5%. And I kind of doubt that personally. I really think there has to be some removal of sanctions, And Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has said very clearly that sanctions have to be removed. So everybody recognizes that this is not the game to play. It's just a question of Americans recognizing what is the game Iranians are playing and recognize that eventually they're not going to win unless they're winning, unless they want to engage in a war. And torturing Iranian middle class, Iranian lower classes is not going to produce a more friendly Iran in the very long run. It's not going to be good for Israel. It's not going to be for Saudi Arabia, for public opinion in the region, in Iran, to change against these countries and against the United States.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience. Jonathan has a question. What current trends, movements might destabilize the regime? He says protests and sanctions don't seem to be doing much. And the second question, Israel is becoming closer to Saudi Arabia, several Gulf countries, Egypt, and others. Will this alliance push Iran to ally even more closely with Turkey, along with its current allies in the region? Kian, do you want to give it a shot?
Yes. So I think the first question was, are there any trends to destabilize the regime inside Iran? Was that the question?
I think that's the question, yeah.
Okay, well, as I mentioned, in my presentation, currently, if we understand the political system or the government or the regime in Iran to be a consolidated regime and not one which is still, its fate is in the air, so to speak, then if we look on the ground and we say, well, where is the opposition to that consolidated regime? And over the last 20, 30 years, it has come from the strongest challenge to it has been by the Islamic Reformists during the Khatami administration. And even though it is true that there was a range of different views within the reformist group, it is also the case, I would contend, that the most far-reaching ambitions of the reformist movement was to significantly transform the regime in the direction of political liberalization. But I think that since 2009, and I put the watershed to be 2009, I think that the reform movement has been almost entirely marginalized from internal Iranian politics. The major political parties have been banned, and there is a new political party that only has a few representatives in a few city councils, which is a kind of the rump of the two major reformist parties, the Participation Front, the Musharikat, Jebhe Musharikat, and the Sazman Inqilab Islami. So internally, I see no opposition in terms of, even if there is any left-wing groups or trade union groups, they are very weak. They're not, and the regime is, I would say, towards the, very much in control. So I don't see any effective opposition from inside Iran against the regime, if that was the question that was being asked. And externally, I don't see any either any serious attempt to create regime change inside Iran. So in terms of the second question about Israel, I mean, I think that we should not underestimate the potential earthquake and tremendous change that the so-called Abraham Accords have created in the Middle East. The new normalization between the Gulf states several Gulf states and now other Muslim states with Israel, I think will have far-reaching impacts. As to the question of whether it will pressure Iran to ally more with Turkey, that's something I will have to wait and see. I don't see at the moment that there are many other areas where Turkey and Iran are competitors in the region. And I would just make one comment, if I may, in response to Djavad's earlier point about the desire of Iranians and the Iranian regime, their ambitions in the region. I think the quote you made from Djavad was very apposite. That is to say, highlighting the potential divergence between the goals of the leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the vast population, various groups of populations. I mean, do we know that there is widespread popular support for Iran's foreign policy in the region? It's difficult to say. There are polling data, but I would be very cautious in drawing firm conclusions based on polling data inside Iran. And finally, I would just make one point, which relating the regional posture of Iran to sanctions. If it is the case that a broad range of population, as I think Djavad may have been just suggesting, does support the type of adversarial posture that the Islamic Republic has against Western interests, then in a sense, I mean, again, I'm not saying that there is widespread popular support, but if there is, then in a sense, what the Iranian population is saying is that we are willing to pay the price and suffer the consequences of sanctions. And I would say that I remember years ago, the speech of a Majlis deputy that struck me as being extremely authentic and very sincere. And he got up on the floor of the Majlis and he said, and that was when I was living in Tehran and there was a crisis of air pollution. You may remember too, Nazila, there was a crisis of air pollution. And the discussion was that part of the reason for pollution in Iran, in Tehran, was because of the low quality of petroleum that was produced by old technology of the refineries in Iran. One Majlis deputy made the speech and he said, if me and my children have to breathe polluted air so that we can stand fast against Western imperialism, then I accept that cost. Although I did ask myself whether he'd ever asked his children about that. But the point being that if it is if there is popular support for this, it puts the question of sanctions slightly differently. And I will just conclude by saying, coming back to your earlier question, I think the Biden administration, and just recently they published their interim national security strategy. I think the Biden administration is focusing more on what is US interests in the region. And that, there are some suggestions, and I think, and if I may, I think Djavad pointed to this in his foreign affairs article. He suggested that one of the goals of US foreign sanctions against Iran was to squeeze the Iranian population. I don't see any evidence for that, and I don't think that there is. I don't think that is a stated policy of the United States. The United States sanction policy, whether it works or not, is another question, but was to prevent the Iranian government from using funds to fund regional policies and support for proxies in the region. I think that if the Biden administration is sticking with that, it will focus more on, it will have to operate with what the Iranian nizam or the regime thinks. And they will not be able to take into account, unfortunately, what what the Iranian population thinks.
Thank you, Kian. We have an interesting question from Nina. The Islamic Republic tried but didn't succeed in disenfranchising women. What do you see as the role of women in Iran today, and how will they assert their rights? Javad, I want to ask this question from you, and I think it would be very interesting to see what role women played or how they were impacted over the past 100 years.
Oh, that's a very nice question. I talk to my mother a lot. She's 95 years old, and her life has spanned a century. I tried to get from her what ordinary people. She's not quite ordinary because she was from a minor nobility from South Khorasan, so they had some land. But the perspective is quite informative. It is mostly about mundane things in life that she wished would happen. She complains about washing with cold water and having a very unfriendly mother-in-law who would prevent her from boiling water because they would use valuable kerosene. If you look at that, and then she talks about the houses she's been, how improvement in housing. And now she Skypes with me. She has electricity, she has natural gas. And when I pointed those things out to her, she begins to realize what social change has happened that she's been witness to. And it's been mostly, if I may say so, improving the lives of women in that sphere. Natural gas coming to people's homes through pipes may have helped men as well, but it really transformed women's lives, not having to go get stuff, like wood or old khashak from the plain to bake bread, to put in their tanur. And if you think about what women used to do to run a household in terms of provision of water and heat and fuel and so on, life has become really comfortable for them. But when you look at another side of women's lives, you see so much negative things, and they're all real. Women are having a hard time in terms of equality in the job market, equality in the national politics. And I want to make sure that people don't lose sight of one when they think about the other, when they think about women. It's fair to say that it is quite possible to tell 90% of economic and social history of Iran by just looking at women's lives, how it has changed. The ups and downs in the economy are very much corresponding to ups and downs of women's lives. Women have benefited in many ways. They used to be very lowly educated, especially rural women. So when you combine two disadvantages, being woman and being rural, you get really bad mixture. And majority of Iranian women were rural women. Their education was very, very low. Only 5% were literate before the revolution. And now the rural women are about as educated as rural men, and urban women are better educated than urban men. So this is some kind of a fundamental fact that one needs to think about. What needs to happen in future, I think, is for women to carefully decide how they can negotiate with an authoritarian government to acquire what they can acquire. So they acquired schools, they acquired equity in education, being able to go to through concours and go to college. There are still some inequities, but more or less they are able to assert themselves in the education sphere, and hopefully they can do that in the labor market. Where they are still having trouble is in the legal sphere, in particular family law. Iranian men can divorce their wives without going through a legal procedure. And a lot of women are focused on changing that, changing the divorce law so that allocation of resources within the household becomes more equal. When men have so much power that they can either, if you like, fire their wives or bring a second wife, then naturally the woman will take a lot less of the resources of the household. And who's going to be hurt there are the little girls who the mother might be more attached to. So how are women going to swim through these very difficult waters? Not to get the ire of the conservatives, but try to ally themselves in such a way with Islamic women who also have daughters, and they don't want their daughters to have to marry someone and then be divorced without them knowing. That, I think, is possible. I think Iran has a lot of reasonable people in it, that if questions like this are packaged not as challenging the entire Islamic Republic, but questions of the legal structure that could very well be compatible with Islam. If they were able to do that, I think they can capitalize on their gains in education and even labor market experience, and then also acquire some legal rights, equitable legal rights. I hope that answers the question.
Kian, we have a question from Natalia. She says that she was surprised to find out that Iranians were very proud of their culture and history before the revolution. And she's asking if that has changed, or is it still the same? And whether Iran is losing its influence in the region, and how might Iranian culture's influence beyond Iran's borders change?
That's an interesting question. It's important to point out, probably, and many writers and historians have pointed out, that if you talk about Iranian culture and Iranian identity, some writers will point out that there are three components of Iranian identity. There is a pre-Islamic Iranian identity, which the Nowruz celebrations symbolize. There is a Islamic component to Iranian identity. It's very long-standing, obviously, over 1,000 years of deeply embedded in Iranian culture. And also since modernity, since the 20th century, a Western, a certain affinity for Western culture. So when we talk about Iranian culture, or even Persian culture, I suppose if we talk about Iranian culture, we would say it has this Persian element, an Islamic element, and a certain kind of modern, globalized, perhaps Western element in it as a hybrid. And so when we ask about the influence of Iranian culture in the region, we might want to ask which one of these is being promoted or highlighted. I think the evidence shows that since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the Shia Islamic dimension of Iranian identity has not been as successfully exported, or let us say, found a presence for itself in the region as the rulers in Iran would have liked it, except for certain Shia groups, which we know about in Iraq and maybe in the Gulf. But otherwise, what has happened, I think, is that the Shia component of the Iranian culture has overwhelmed the Persian and Persian-speaking dimension, and has prevented, I think, the ability of Iranians and Persian culture to be more influential in the larger region, in areas which are Persian-speaking, like Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and maybe other parts of Armenia and so forth. That's one aspect of it. The question of, are Iranians still proud of their culture? My experience is that Iranians are very proud of their culture. They remain proud of their culture. It's very interesting in terms of the Nowruz, which is the occasion for our meeting tonight, is that after the 1979 revolution, there was talk and some steps taken by the ruling clerics to either eliminate or to downplay the Persian elements of Iranian identity and culture. But I think that the Persianness of Iranians is very strong, and also, and that is a reflection of the fact that the Persian language is very unique to Iran. I mean, even though, as I mentioned, it is spoken in Tajikistan and parts of Afghanistan, but Iran is very unique in its language, and the language is unique in its longevity and its richness in terms of literature and poetry and so forth. And so I think that anyone who rules Iran would pay a very, very high cost if they undermined that element of societal cohesion. So I think that that's one of the reasons it remains strong inside Iran. The government sometimes does push back against expressions of public expressions of pre-Islamic ceremonies, but I think Iranians are very proud of their culture. I will finally, though, say it is, I think, true, and I think it's something that I wonder whether Djavad would agree with me, and you, Nazila, too. I think that often the Islamic dimension of Iranian identity is sometimes underplayed. That is to say, it is assumed that somehow it can be subsumed under a pre-Islamic identity. And I find that that's, I don't find much evidence for that. I find that there's a tremendous institutionalization and cultural memory and traditions of the Iranian Islamic Shia identity. And so this kind of hybridity is something that I think Iranians will struggle with. As I mentioned in my presentation, the vision for the future will have to, I think, that if there is a progress in terms of providing a accommodation for a wide ranging of all Iranians, or let's say the maximum number of Iranians, there's got to be a way to find an accommodation for all those three visions of the future. Although logically you can understand why the Velayi, the current rulers, will have to compromise more than the other two. But the Persianness, the Islamicness, and the modernness, I think those are the visions that somehow have to find a way. And I don't see a way forward currently, but as I say, I think that's the path for the future.
And Kian, I just want to emphasize, and I want you to tell me if you agree, when you say Persian culture, you're referring to the culture of the region that was once called Persian. You're not referring to Persian speakers per se. You're referring to all those ethnic and religious groups that lived in the region called Persia. Right?
Yes, I think, yes. I mean, let me be specific here. I don't want to be taken to, let's say, demean any other ethnic group or other speakers. Iran itself is a multilingual, multi-ethnic country. There are 40% or more are Azeri speakers, and there are many other minority speakers. But the fact remains that it is not that Persian is still a unifying language inside of Iran. And whether, well, this is the point I was making. I don't think Iran has been successful in creating bridges to non-Iranian Persian-speaking peoples. So, the question is why, with so many Persian speakers in Afghanistan and in Tajikistan, why has the current regime not been able to build more bridges? And I think one of the reasons is because Shiaism is a block to making bridges to Sunni Muslims and to other other minorities in the region.
Kian, there's a question that I think, because you referred to it a little bit, you would be in a good position to answer. And I think in the audience, we have people who would like to know more about the sort of Iran's historical and cultural background and how Iranians or Persians accommodated what they got from different cultures that invaded them, from the Turks, from the Arabs, from the Mongols. So we had a question from Christina, who's asking, how do Iranians accommodate Shiite Islam with national festivals such as Nowruz? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, as I mentioned, I think that at the beginning, the first decade of the revolution, there was an attempt by the ruling elites and the ruling clerics to sideline the traditional expressions of pre-Islamic Persian culture or pre-Islamic Iranian culture. So, I mean, in one way I could say there's a short answer and a long answer. That's the short answer.
Kian, I think the question goes further back, goes back to foreign invasions over the past hundreds of years and how Iranians have been able to sort of assimilate and preserve their Persian culture.
Yes, I mean, I think that, it is a fact that Iran was one of the few countries that when they were invaded by the Arab Muslims of the beginning of Islam, that they did not become Arab in terms of culture or in terms of language. So Iran was unique in maintaining its language, even though they became Muslim. Now going further back, there's a very interesting aspect of the way in which Shia Islam has assimilated even pre-Islamic Iranian religious components. And that is to say that if you look to see the way in which Shiaism separated itself from Sunniism, it incorporated many Zoroastrian themes and even many aspects of Zoroastrian theology into its understanding, into its worldview. And so one of the ways in which Iranians have assimilated both the Arab invasions and the Arab and the transformation into a Muslim country was to turn it into something distinctive. And that something distinctive was Shiaism, and spoken with a Persian language, which in turn influenced Arabic. This was one of the ways in which Iran has been able to assimilate. But the fact is that it not only assimilated, it did become Muslim. And with the 1979 revolution, a very, very fundamentalist, we should say, very, or let's say orthodox form of Shiism became dominant in the country. And that is a new phase of Iranian history.
Djavad, we have a question from Nancy, who wants to know how dependent is Iran's economy on oil and gas, and has Iran tried to make any changes to that dependence?
Yeah, it's a very good question. As I mentioned earlier, the share of oil in Iran's total production has declined. So in that sense, it's become less dependent. But that level of independence that Iran has gained has not come voluntarily, which is worrisome. It's because of sanctions. It is very hard for Iranians to collectively decide that they want to be working harder, making things, rather than just buy them from outside. So government policy here is very important. And for years, if not for decades, if you ask Iranians, do you like to be dependent on oil, or would you like to be more like Turkey or an advanced country? They would say the latter. It's like people who want to lose weight. They want to lose weight, but they can't. But if they end up in a desert without food for a while, they will lose weight. I think that's what has happened to Iran. What Iranians need to do, and right now I think it's very difficult because politics has become so confrontational, to find a way to bring policies like raising energy prices domestically. As you know, Iran now consumes or produces more energy for its domestic market. In the good days, 10 years ago, it used twice as much energy domestically as it exported. So Iran is no longer wealthy by exports of oil, but it is wealthy because it uses a lot of energy domestically. Iranians use a lot more gasoline, natural gas than Turks, for example, whose per capita income is at least 25% higher than Iranians. To try to bring that down, because that's also a kind of energy independence. If you are not addicted to cars, you're not addicted to cheap energy. It needs governments can raise the price of energy. This happened, as Kian also mentioned earlier, in 2011 with the cash transfer program. And the way Iranians went about this collectively to decide whether that was good or bad was really disappointing. A lot of people attacked that decision. A lot of economists came against cash transfer to the poor. And it opened up, revealed fissures in Iranian society that makes me doubt if they can collectively make decisions. These are not easy decisions for any country to make, to voluntarily give up some short-term benefits, which is, I want to buy a foreign car, I want to travel abroad, I want new airplanes and all those things, versus more fundamental stuff. I want my young daughter to be able to find a job. These are transactions that have to be made by a society, and economics helps, but ultimately politics is very important. And if politics deteriorates further in Iran, and it can easily do that, we have in our neighborhood several countries that have become almost failed states. If Iranians lose the mechanisms they do have to talk to each other, to pass laws and so on, then reducing energy dependence is going to be only done when foreigners prevent us from using our energy. And that would be very unfortunate.
But the government has been boasting that it has become less dependent on oil and gas. Are there numbers, reliable numbers?
Well, if they're talking about they are producing about the same or a bit more with much less export of oil, they're absolutely correct. That's what I mentioned when I said over the last couple of decades, we've gone from 50% of oil and gas to 15%. But if they mean that we can produce without cheap energy domestically, they are not right, because energy prices are very low. And that's one of the advantages Iran has in beating competition in regional markets. But that's a very bad kind of advantage to have. Eventually they catch up with you. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, will prevent you from coming in, subsidizing goods with energy. You, in the end, want to depend on what the industrialized world depends on, which is human ingenuity, human capital. And Iranians have a big decision to shift from being rich with oil to being rich with skills. Again, I wish Iranian politics was more fluid, would accommodate this kind of big national decision-making. Think of how education in Iran can be reformed. There are people who will tell you it's very easy. You need to hire better teachers. You need to reduce the amount of testing you do. You need to reduce the selection to universities with multiple choice exams. These are all well-known solutions, but try to implement them. It's very difficult. One of the tragedies that Iran is facing at 1400 is that it has accumulated several problems. And at the same time that the problems have become more severe, its capacity to collectively solve them has decreased.
There's a question about urban and rural inequality since the beginning of the revolution. Has that decreased or increased? How has it changed over the past 4 decades?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
Well, you go back to the beginning of the last century, right? 100 years ago, which is my favorite time
The question
to go.
is the beginning of the revolution. I think we can have a shorter answer.
Well, no, the answer requires going back. You know, a lot of Iranians don't want to think of themselves as a feudal country. Most Iranians have a strong feudal heritage. Majority of them can trace their parents or grandparents to being a rayat. In the United States, you can't say, well, I don't want to talk about from before slavery, or I don't want to talk before civil war. I don't want to talk before. See, you have to take the whole thing. So Iran was highly, highly unequal on the grounds of being a very strong class society. When you had arbab and rayat, and people who are interested in Iranian future of Iran need to understand that. The same way Americans who want to move forward need to understand slavery. They can't just say, oh, that's past. We don't want to talk about it. So Iran had a revolution, and that revolution forced the government to become much nicer to rural people. Before the revolution, there was urban bias, a very strong urban bias. If you look at the expansion of electricity network, expansion of piped water, all these important things for life, most of it was in urban areas. After the revolution, all of a sudden, there was this reconstruction crusade. There was a lot of investment that shifted, public investment, that shifted from urban to rural areas. Very quickly, rural areas were electrified. They now all have clean water, piped water, and natural gas has gone to many rural homes. So the rural-urban difference, which was the main source of inequality in Iran, closed considerably. If you look at the overall inequality, the Gini coefficient before the revolution or right around the revolution was 0.56. This is inequality of income, not talking about other things like access to schools, social status, and so on. After the revolution, it came down, didn't come down nearly enough at this as the Islamic Republic had promised. The Gini coefficient is now about 0.4, which is what you have in Turkey, which is what you have in the United States, which are by no means equal societies. Only in the last few years, because of sanctions, and maybe because Iranians have become more urbanized, the urban bias has picked up again. That's why in the graphs that I showed, you saw such a big gap in terms of impact of sanctions between Tehran, which contains 15% of Iranians, and rural areas, which house about 25% of Iranians. There's a big gap that's developing there, and the rural-urban gap in some sense has disappeared because many rural areas are now connected to urban areas. People, the peri-urban phenomena that Kian is much more familiar with. There are no rural areas the way they were when I was a child. They were completely isolated. They lived in a different world. Now everybody takes the bus and can get quickly into the city center, but they see the differences in living. If a rural person or person from a small town goes to Tehran, they're going to be flabbergasted with the amount of inequality they see. There are high rises with helicopter pads No helicopter lands on those, but it's ostentatious consumption, the Lamborghinis and the other luxury cars you see in Tehran. So I'm afraid there's been a lot of walking back in terms of equality. Again, possibly because Iran's politics is failing to deal with important issues. It's gone into side issues, some of it foreign policy, and is not able to bring back the good old days of the beginning of the revolution, when rural areas or other disadvantaged areas were getting a leg up.
Thank you. We have one more question, which would be good for closing this conversation. Djavad, Kian, you can answer if you have anything to say about it. What are the chances that an enlightened Sardar, an enlightened Revolutionary Guard leader, as in Reza Khan, would rise out of the IRGC, especially if Rahbar, the supreme leader, were to pass on?
I can say something about it, but I'd rather hear
go ahead,
Kian first.
No, go ahead, Djavad.
Okay. Well, economists have actually something to say about this. So I would say the short answer is that time for Reza Khan has passed. Reza Khan came at a time when Iran needed a strong leader, a determined person with a vision for railroads, for construction, for post office, for communication, for putting down local rebellions and creating stability for the country. Then came the Mohammad Reza Shah, his son, who went one step further, letting industry to grow with private enterprise. And all of that seemed to work in an authoritarian fashion. One strong person could decide, we want tariffs like this so auto industry can take off. We want a railroad here, we want a bridge there. Now, Iran has gone beyond that. You know, it has factories, it has very good infrastructure. What it needs is incentives, motivation for people to do the best thing, which is to get skills and go to work. And that is kind of antithetical to an authoritarian leader who tells people what to do. Is that person from Sardar going to tell a rural girl to study hard? Or when she studies, to study the right skills? Or when she's finished graduating, instead of looking for the government for a job, to go search, to go maybe set up a business. There are a lot of women's businesses, but there could be a lot more. All these things are making Iran's economy vibrant, and they are outside the power and purview of the state. So I'm afraid Iranians have to come to terms with the fact that they need institutions, they need better rules to get better governance, not a strong man.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to just make a few comments based on what of Javad's excellent summary. I would say that, it makes me think that, I went to Iran working on political development. That is to say, I was working for an organization promoting democracy and more connections with the Western world, because I believed that that was necessary for Iran to be able to harness its human resources and its own material resources to grow economically. As an academic, I have been researching, I have a very niche area of research, which is local government and decentralization. But one of the things I found is that despite, of course, my own proclivity in support of political development and the improvement of democracy, I compare Iran to China. And I think China has important lessons for Iran in the sense that, even though it's not a political system that I support or that I would endorse, but China is a non-democratic, illiberal political system. It's an authoritarian system, and yet it has succeeded through being very creative with how it works with its local governments in creating an economic miracle. it has created a massive increase in economic opportunity for its people. And those are the kinds of incentives that I counterintuitively found was in fact compatible with a non-democratic system. And so Iran, I think, can learn lessons, because I think that, we worry about a young generation that cannot find jobs and that cannot find the right kind of, economic environment in which to grow, to compete. And I'm not happy that Iran would have to emulate China in all its areas, but if it could emulate some of the reforms to improve local economies throughout the country, I think that would be a huge benefit, and it would be compatible. It would be compatible with Iran's current political system, even though many people would be unhappy with the current Iranian system. But I think that many young people may not be able to wait for a significant political transformation, but they could certainly benefit from an economic transformation.
Well, like always, thank you so much, Kian. You were great. Djavad, thank you so much for your contribution. And thank you to everybody who came and asked questions. There will be a recording of this panel within 24 hours on YouTube, and all the participants will get a link to it. Thank you, and we will end this conversation here. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.